Thank you, Mark. And now we'll hear from Steve Lemery on expanded access.
Thank you as well for the invitation to talk. This will be a little bit of a different topic than the ones we've heard before. This is not technically research, although as I'll show that some expanded access use can be used in drug development to support approval in some cases. So here's the outline. Do an overview of expanded access to just orient everyone in the room if they're not aware of the process. Then I'll do a little bit about our OHOP and CEDAR experience and data regarding expanded access, followed by some drug development considerations for expanded access, and then evidence pertaining to the risk related to expanded access for industry. So these are the subpart I criteria for expanded access. So it's a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition, no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy. And again, this doesn't necessarily have to mean you have to exhausted all available approved therapies if you can make a justification that a specific therapy is not adequate alternative therapy. For example, if you know that a particular therapy may be too toxic for your patient, you certainly can make a justification that your patient shouldn't be exposed to that therapy before going on expanded access. The potential benefit should justify the risks, and understanding that most of these requests in oncology for patients with end-stage malignancies. And providing access will not interfere with clinical investigations that could support marketing approval. These are the types of expanded access. So the typical single patient INDs, either emergency or non-emergency requests. These are most of them that we receive in CEDAR and OHOP are single patient requests by investigators. The investigator will get a letter of cross-reference from the commercial sponsor to allow the IND to proceed. We also have provisions for intermediate-sized population INDs and treatment INDs. Treatment INDs are often sort of towards the end of development where a company has completed their marketing study and plans to submit an NDA or BLA, and to support access at the time, they may submit a treatment IND. Expanded access protocols can also be submitted by commercial sponsors to their existing INDs, and we sometimes see these. However, probably the majority of them are the single patient INDs by investigators. It's important to note that ultimately approval represents the most optimal mechanism for patient access to new drugs. These are some additional expanded access requirements. So ultimately you have to have a patient, physician, and a drug provider or sponsor willing to participate. And as I mentioned, for these single patient INDs, the commercial sponsor will provide a letter of authorization to support the IND. And again, I think there may be legitimate reasons why a commercial manufacturer may not be able to provide expanded access, for example, drug supplies. And I think there was a recent article in JAMA with Dr. Arthur Kaplan discussing that this instance where a company had limited supplies of product, and they ultimately said, I think it was a lottery system to support expanded access. So submission, the physician has to submit an application, and now we have the form 3926, which I'll mention in a second, for single patient IND request. However, an emergency expanded access request can be granted over the phone or an email, for example, prior to submission of the complete application. Expanded access also requires IRB approval and consent, with the exception of emergency INDs, which can begin prior to IRB notification. So you have to notify the IRB within 5 days of the expanded access use if FDA approves the request. So I mentioned the form 3926. I don't have an example here, but it's basically a 1.5-page form that makes it much easier for physicians of their patients to complete the process. So you fill out this form, get a letter of cross-reference from the company, and we can approve the single patient request based on this form. I think it's helpful for commercial sponsors if they're using this to provide monitoring plan that, especially if the investigator is not, doesn't have a lot of experience with that drug. So I think that can be very useful. And as I mentioned here, protocols or additional information, if necessary, can be attached. So talk a little bit about CEDAR experience with expanded access. So across CEDAR, this is not just oncology, but across all divisions, in about a 10-year experience, we went over 10,000 requests for expanded access. Close to 9,000 were new single-patient IND applications. So as you can see, the vast majority are allowed to proceed. 99.3% were allowed to proceed. 24 single-patient INDs were placed on hold for various reasons. 10 were later allowed to proceed. There's also this category of emergency IND denials. Most of these were non-oncology. The vast majority were non-oncology, and the most common reason was request was not an emergency that was cited. That doesn't necessarily preclude the investigator from submitting a separate single-patient IND, but that's all we have for that. So I did a separate analysis of SPIs in oncology, but I delved a lot deeper in this investigation. So we did only 3 years as opposed to 10 years. So of 1,300 single-patient INDs from 2012 to 2014, only 2 were placed on hold, one of which was subsequently allowed to proceed. 4 were withdrawn prior to FDA decision. The median review time for these was only 2 days. For emergency INDs, it was less than 24 hours. So we generally try to get to these in an expedited fashion. Even if they're not an emergency request, we try to get to them, really quickly. So in this 1,300 requests, there were 157 unique drugs, and about 2/3 of them were from what I considered a major university hospital, which means that 1/3 of them came from community centers. This may be slightly out of date, but at the time I did the analysis, 61% of the requests for drugs that were subsequently approved. And I don't know, the information we get in the submissions, there may be limited demographic data. So we had age available in 62% of the requests, race, ethnicity in only 10%, and sex in 65%. Although there are, I imputed sex for patients with ovarian and prostate cancer. I didn't impute for breast cancer. 8% of the requests with data available were for patients less than 17 years of age. And annual reports received. So one of the ways we get some safety information in INDs is through annual reports. And these were, this analysis was for INDs that were open at least a year that we should have gotten an annual report. So as you can see, we don't get a lot of information in these single patient requests. I also looked in the withdrawal letters. So we reviewed 100 single-patient IND withdrawal letters to see, is there data about the patient's course in these withdrawal letters, for example, that could help, that can have us consider the drug in the drug development paradigm. So most contained some disease-related information. However, in general, this information was not useful. For example, you might get information that simply that the patient stopped the drug due to progression without information on prior response, listings of adverse events, or date of relapse. So a conclusion regarding the data that we get in these is without planning from commercial sponsor, you're unlikely to get useful or interpretable information from these requests. So if you think you may want to get information from these requests, you probably should plan on it and work with either the investigators or submit the INDs yourselves to get, for example, you can get even limited information about with X-ray or CT scans, for example. You can collect that information. So how could single patient expanded access information be useful in an NDA or BLA? So rare diseases, for example, or rare mutations with drugs with high response rates where you can interpret that single patient use, you could potentially get information from these single patient requests. Maybe getting data who do not meet all eligibility criteria. Gives you some real world experience. Single patient protocols under a sponsor's IND might facilitate this approach. Again, you may not be getting all the data you would get in a clinical trial. However, you can at least get scans and demographic information. So Gwen talked a little bit about this, but the strategies to assess treatment effects in ultra-rare diseases or ultra-rare mutations in certain cancers. Again, broaden eligibility criteria, increase the number of sites, which may or may not be practical in all situations. But in some situations, you can't enroll necessarily everywhere in the United States or the world. There may be areas of the country that are sparsely populated where it would not necessarily make a lot of sense to go for a rare disease. So expanded access might be a good way to get information about the use of your drug. I have 4 drugs that OHOP has approved with a lot of data from expanded access or uses of these drugs, one of which, eculizumab, was not for a cancer indication per se, for a hematology indication. So I wasn't involved in any of these approvals, but I'll just mention them briefly. So glucarpidase was the first one, which was approved for toxic plasma methotrexate concentrations in patients with impaired renal function. So the primary basis for approval was the NCI expanded access study. I think as a fellow, actually was involved in one of the expanded access requests in a patient with CNS lymphoma that had high-dose methotrexate who, unfortunately, his kidneys failed while getting the methotrexate. So the efficacy was assessed based on pre- and post-treatment plasma samples measuring methotrexate, and approval is basically based on expanded access use. Another case for chemotherapy toxicity was the recent approval of uridine triacetate for 5-FU or capecitabine overdose or severe toxicity. This approval is based on effects observed in 2 open-label access studies. Basically, survival was assessed in these patients, as were PD effects that supported the approval of this drug. So eculizumab was the third study. This data was in 19 patients, pediatric patients. It was basically, I think the drug was approved in adult use, but the expanded access use supported extrapolation to the pediatric use in patients with atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. Again, a very, very, very rare disease. Finally, dinutuximab, which the approval was mainly of this drug in pediatric patients with high-risk neuroblastoma. The primary basis for approval was a randomized controlled trial. However, data from an expanded access study provided safety information considered for approval. And these data are described in product labeling. So what is the evidence regarding risk of expanded access? Again, expanded access, we did a study over a 10-year period, over 10,000 expanded access requests. Only 2 commercial programs of over 1,000 reference INDs were placed on hold or partial hold due to a serious adverse event in an expanded access IND. One of these holds was removed months later, and the other was a partial hold limited to a specific population, and that hold was subsequently removed as well. So very, very few commercial programs are put on hold. It's exceedingly rare due to an event under expanded access. So what is the reality in oncology? FDA review staff are trained oncologists who understand context of adverse events in expanded access. Again, these patients unfortunately have late-stage cancers and may have other comorbidities. While not related specifically to expanded access, FDA safety reporting guidance talks about some of these considerations. For example, anticipated events and events that cannot be interpreted in a single patient. For example, a patient over 80 years old who gets an MI, or a patient with colon cancer develops GI perforation or obstruction in a trial, you can't necessarily interpret that event in a single patient. So it's, we understand that. And then I think this, Dr. Masicki from FDA gave another talk, and there was questions about whether any drugs had been CR'd, not approved based on expanded access. This is the only data that are publicly available. There was a study by Dr. Kozin that looked at marketing applications of NDAs for over a 10-year period, 15 CR letters. Most were due to lack of efficacy. Others were due to trial design flaws. None were due to an expanded access experience. So although this only covered NDAs, not BLAs, I think as a reviewer in oncology, I think all would agree that expanded access has never been the reason that I'm aware of a CR in an NDA or a BLA. So takeaways: providing treatment options for patients with life-threatening diseases and no available therapies is what expanded access is designed to do. It's compassionate use. Most requests are not primarily intended to support development, provide information about the drug. It's really to provide a treatment option for a patient with a life-threatening disease. However, in some cases, data from expanded access could be used to support approval of a drug. As I mentioned, expanded access may be a means to obtain important data, especially in rare diseases and in drugs with large treatment effects. If expanded access data may be useful, try to recognize this early so you can work with your investigators and clinicians to obtain the data that may be needed to support that approval. For example, design the case report forms, even if limited, to get at least CT scans to look at response. Concerns regarding negative effects on drug development are not supported by data, as I mentioned before. Again, while safety is assessed in these uses, it is exceedingly rare for a serious adverse event to result in a clinical hold to a commercial IND. In both cases, the holds were subsequently lifted. In oncology, drugs not approved due to lack of efficacy or trial design, drugs are not approved due to lack of efficacy or trial design issues, not expanded access use. Risk-benefit is important in oncology, but this risk-benefit determination is highly unlikely to be affected by a serious event in a single patient. Safety risks are accepted by patients and oncologists in oncology if the drug does provide benefit. Again, we have lots of chemotherapeutic drugs that have lots of toxicities, and we understand that. And that's the end. Thank you.